John and I have been having this conversation about atonement for almost 20
Most
years.
anil.
We have the Alliance to thank for this because we can date the first conversation specifically to the Alliance meeting in Dayton, Ohio in 2004. Don't tell me Baptist ministers don't know how to have fun. We're sitting in the hallway of the hotel of the Alliance in Dayton, Ohio on a Friday night talking about atonement. That's where it began, right there.
We both had young kids asleep in the hotel rooms, and we were in the door jams of so we could hear the kids if they needed us. Then when we were sure that they were asleep, we moved by the elevators, and some folks may remember stepping around us. Sydney, my oldest, who is in college now, was 1 year old at that time and took her first steps in that hotel hallway.
I remember that conversation somewhat vividly. It's been a long time ago, but I still remember it. And we were having some pretty deep conversation about sacrificial atonement, about substitutionary atonement, blood atonement, and that's where it began in the hallway that night in Dayton, Ohio.
In that hallway 20 years ago, we were talking about blood hymns specifically. Yeah. And we were talking about how we were both uncomfortable with them, how we didn't sing them, how we didn't incorporate them into our worship. But we were also trying to figure out, okay, so is there anything of value in this that we need to hold on to? And if so, what?
Yeah. And those hymns, John, I could sing them all. I had not been in churches for a good while that sang those hymns, but I knew them all from heart. I was a Southern Baptist preacher's kid, and that theology, maybe particularly through the hymns, was really ingrained in the theology I was raised with.
PK, MK, preacher's kid, missionary's kid, Southern Baptist, we both grew up with substitutionary atonement in our blood, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. I think you began to question that before I did, had some critique of that, but before I was willing to question some of that.
But it wasn't theological, right? It was,
yeah.
It was gross. It was gross imagery. It was that gory fountain that seemed and still does like a bizarre mix of Stephen King and Flannery O'Connor and Jordan Peele and then on top of it being gross, it just seemed like it wasn't a very good story. Substitutionary, transactional, those are words that I would use now. I didn't have them back then. It just felt like a shallow... There's a better story to tell than this.
I think it took me a lot longer time to begin processing. And as I think back through my story, it's really kind of the last part of my theology that I have begun to critique. And it happened 20 years ago. But it took me a longer time to begin kind of rethinking that story, I think, than you had.
And it was more an intellectual inconsistency, right?
At that point, it was for me. I had begun to engage with theological questions. I had wonderful mentors, college professors, seminary professors, friends, and we had great conversations and all of that. And it was for me, it really was a theological, intellectual inquiry into that. So I didn't have the initial response that you had about the story being gross. It was just so much part of a part of the tradition I was raised in. I never questioned that until academically, I guess, as part of my education, I began to think critically about the story. John, one thing you said in that hall that I'll never forget, we were talking about the blood hymns, and I remember you saying, if it were up to me, I would have to take all of those blood hymns out, but I'd have to find a way to leave the blood in. And that statement stuck with me, and it's been something I have pondered for a long time. I'd have to take the blood hymns out, but I'd have to find a way to leave the blood in.
And you told me that years later, and I didn't even remember saying
it. There are about 3 John Ballerisms that I keep with me all the time, and that's one of them, John. I'd have to find a way to leave the blood.
I do remember, thinking about how blood is as much a symbol or more of a symbol of life than it is of death. Blood poured out is the traditional imagery, but blood coursing through the veins, that's life. And then also the importance that blood gives. When you're with your best friend and you do we're going to be blood brothers, and then signed in blood. So there's something about blood indicating this is profoundly important.
One thing I have learned to say in these 20 years is that love that doesn't cost is probably not real love. And love that costs blood is costly, that cost our lives. Donald Bailey says there is an atonement in the heart of God. And for me, learning that God is sacrificial love, God is self-giving love, but that's different than requiring the death of someone to pay. It is a matter of me learning the participation to share in that commitment that Jesus knew, and finding that sacrificial love that's at the heart of God, that has been so important for me in this conversation.
Yeah.
You can hear it at least as far back as the prophet Samuel, the last of the judges of Israel, who says in dialogue with King Saul, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obedience to the voice of the Lord? Surely to obey is better than sacrifice." This bold critique of the theology of sacrifice dates 1,000 years before Jesus. Then 8 centuries before Jesus, the prophet Micah puts an even finer point on it. Amy and I quote part of this prophecy every Sunday in our benediction. "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before God with burnt offerings? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God?" Does God require sacrifice? Or does God just want our obedience in justice and mercy and kindness? I hope you understand how radical the actions of Jesus were that day. They challenged the very core of the religion as most Jews understood it at the time. And though that prophetic critique had been offered for at least 1,000 years, the challenge was regarded as blasphemy, dangerous heresy. It got him killed. But the practice and theology of sacrifice has always been attractive to human beings. It is easier to symbolically put our sins on the back of a goat, a scapegoat, and drive that goat out into the wilderness, or to literally sacrifice one human being for another. That's easier than to accept our own responsibility. Caiaphas, who was the high priest in Jerusalem, who participated in the crucifixion of Jesus, sneered in righteous indignation at the people as he said, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die than for the whole people to be destroyed." Thousands of years of human bloodshed have been justified by what Walter Wink calls this myth of redemptive violence. The powerful idea that violence is often necessary, can be good, even ordained of God, that all manner of death and bloodshed can be justified by a theology of sacrifice. I hope you understand by now why this is difficult. Because that system Jesus sought to overturn is still with us. And not just on some periphery of Christianity. That system of atonement by sacrifice that was the heart of temple practice has been reconstituted in a belief that Jesus himself was the final victim, offered on the altar of the world to appease a bloodthirsty God. The prophet Micah asked the rhetorical question so beautifully, "Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions?" And though he answers in absolute terms, this kind of sacrifice is precisely not what God demands. That very same theology of sacrifice, the redemptive violence of the death of Jesus, is how many Christians still understand God. What we need to understand from Micah's prophetic challenge, on the contrary, is that the sacrifice called for is not the substitute of Jesus' life for our own, but our participation in that kind of self-giving love. It is participatory atonement. We take up our own cross. We learn to live and love sacrificially, just as Jesus did. The prophetic calling and the life of Jesus invite us to a participatory atonement, not to substitutionary sacrifice.
We have turned atonement into one more thing that we affirm or believe, however we understand it. One more separate thing, when all of theology is abstracted from the story from which nothing should be separate, the story that is an expression of who God is, and so of how God is. All, even traditional ways of telling the story of atonement, all stories of atonement resonate with the truth of brokenness, alienation, separation, suffering. And as such, they're all part of the first story that starts with this idea of everyone and everything in some right order, though it's a story that quickly morphs into every other story, order dissolved. And not about whether there can be any going back to some right order, but whether or not there can be hope with integrity. Not fix something, not restore something, just within the chaos, restore chaos into a trajectory of good, a trajectory of hope. It takes a ruthless honesty about the chaos of what's been broken, or to not be passive about it, the chaos of all that we have broken, and then to get from where we are to where we might legitimately hope again. Here's a partial list of that about which we need to be ruthlessly honest. The way we have treated indigenous people, treated women, treated Africans and African Americans, treated Jews, Hispanics, those from China, Japan, Ireland, the way we have treated those of different sexual orientation and gender identity, the way we have treated the other. And I represent the we, of course, that are white males, the measure against which all else is other. The story of those the church has abused is deep and wide, and implications extend into a divided country, and taking sides versus siding with justice, and a deep anger at all who make of our gospel tradition something inhospitable, something small, angry, ungraceful, unjust, and mean. Though the point is not to be right, the point is not to be on the right side, but to figure out how to restore hope. Now, do I believe that God goes to stunning lengths, taking wondrous initiative to restore and to restore? Oh, yes, yes. And we dare not make that too small a story. Too many settle for a small story, and because they were raised to think that it was a big story. But to make a God story even about Jesus, just about Jesus and Jesus' unbelievable acts of grace and love, even in apparent piety and respect, is to make it too small a story, though that is admittedly convenient at times. Affirm something unbelievable, and maybe the unbelievable will not be expected of you. And what if the story of Jesus was never meant to be taken as requiring our individualized assent to our dependence on what someone else did that we cannot? On Jesus' stunning initiative to restore relationship, what if it was told as an example, as encouragement, inspiration for our own initiatives to restore? To participate with the story of Jesus in the brokenness of a groaning creation, longing for someone within the brokenness to claim the hope of redemption. Frankly, I don't think God much cares about any kind of salvation, private salvation, that does not include the restoring of all creation. That is always the first story, and that is always the last story, and it is every story worth telling. So atonement not as what Jesus did, but rather what we are to do in order to follow Jesus in the way of God. And it's interpersonal, it's systemic, it's corporate and cultural, it's national, it's holistic. And then, like in the story of Jesus, while we might pay and might pay dearly to restore hope into the mess, while there might in truth be a cost, there is not a price, much less one that God requires. So here's the question that atonement poses us, and we do better, don't you think, to think of theology as questions posed of us rather than just of affirmations made of God. Here's the question atonement poses us. Does it shape the way we do everyday life? Does it restore today? So there are as many stories of atonement as there are people and communities atoning. And we're the ones who look to Jesus, but in our systematic mentality, our categorizing mentality, we would do well to remember that atonement is always just part of the story of God and the story of Jesus, and as those who follow Jesus, is supposed to be the story of us.
Thinking about story, John, makes me think about children and the stories we tell our children, and that takes me back to Dayton. One of our 4 children wasn't born at that time. The other 3 were babies, and I think about those 4 children of ours now who have grown up hearing a different story than you and I were taught. As you and I have been developing our own theology, learning to tell the story in a different way, I think about our children, and I think what a gift that is that we've been able to give to our children.
They start at a place that we had to struggle to get to and struggle to justify. And in a way, that's just a wonderfully hopeful, joyful legacy.
And I can only hope that it's they won't have to give up so much that we've had to give up to relearn. So hopefully they are starting at a different point in their understanding of this wonderful story.
And then because it's a truth that keeps growing us, they're going to discover and explore and tell new stories and diverse stories, and it's all just, there's more to come.
Thanks for 20 years of conversation.
Amen.